How are we to understand Old Testament justice? You've heard it being said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Often when people read the Old Testament, they find it difficult to marry that with the New Testament Jesus. Now, because the Old Testament scriptures had become so obscured during the time of Jesus by the teachings of the Pharisees, Jesus made sure he expounded the real meaning that God intended when he gave that law. Now, Israel, from the time of Moses, had been a sovereign nation under God. They had been given their constitution, the Torah, by God himself. And so from that time up to the time of Christ, they had existed predominantly as a sovereign nation. However, they had instances like the Babylonian captivity and the Roman rule that had lost their sovereignty. And so even though they had the constitution of the Torah, there were certain laws that they couldn't put into practice because there was a nation who had subdued them and they were subject to Roman rule. So within the Israelite constitution, the law governed every aspect of life, from civil justice to personal conduct. So when it comes to the principle of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, this is something to do with civil justice, where the judges of the nation had a standard of what justice was in the eyes of God. And the purpose of that principle is to say that the punishment must fit the crime. When you look at Israel under Roman rule, or even Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Babylon, because they refused to bow down to the statue, the punishment was burning in a fiery furnace that was 10 times hotter than normal, just for liberty of conscience and freedom of religion. Now, that punishment does not fit the crime. They didn't hurt anybody. However, because the laws were determined by the Babylonian monarchy, there was no cry for justice because he was the ultimate authority and the religious authority. In the time of Jesus, everyone knows that Jesus was crucified between two thieves, one on his right side, one on his left. Now, does it really fit the crime of stealing to be crucified and left to hang there and bleed to death and suffocate? By modern standards, it would be totally unjust. But even by biblical standards, it would be unjust to kill someone for stealing something. Murder is irreparable, but when you steal something, the biblical mandate was you were to restore fivefold. If you read in Exodus chapter 22, verses 1 to 4, the punishment for being caught stealing was, if a man shall steal an ox or a sheep and kill it or sell it, he shall restore 5 oxen for an ox or 4 sheep for a sheep. The punishment for rape was certainly different to the punishment for consensual fornication. Both were wrong in the eyes of God, but rape was certainly a more grievous sin than fornication. In the case of fornication, if you slept with a girl who was a virgin, you were then to marry her and you were to pay to the parents the dowry or the bride price. Now, this makes sense because surely the punishment must fit the crime. Now, when Jesus was brought before Pilate, just to illustrate the scenario here, it says in John in chapter 18 from verse 29 to 35, it says, Pilate went unto them and said, What accusation do you bring against this man? Speaking of Jesus. They answered and said to him, If he were not a malefactor, or in other words, a criminal or an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you. Then Pilate said to them, Take ye him and judge him according to your law. Now Pilate knew that there was a system of Jewish justice. However, while they were under Roman rule, they didn't have their national sovereignty. So in terms of civil justice, they couldn't institute capital punishment. So then the Jews go on to say in response to Pilate, "It is not lawful for us to put any man to death." And certainly under Roman rule, it was not lawful for them to put any man to death, even though it was mandated in the Jewish constitution. So that gives you an idea of Roman justice versus Jewish justice. What was fair in Jewish justice was the punishment must fit the crime. But because there was no license to apply that, they had to submit to Roman standards of justice, which were a person accused of stealing was crucified. And in Jesus' case, even though the judge said he was innocent, he was still crucified. There was no appeal court. There was nothing. What the judge said was final. And so Jesus was crucified unjustly between two thieves who were given injustice because that's not what stealing deserves. And ultimately, that clarifies the perspective of God, trying to preserve people from manipulating what true justice is and using their authority and preserving the world from tyranny, like we have witnessed with countless dictators like Hitler and all the others like him, who used their sovereign power to inflict such cruelty because they could, and there was no rule of law and standard of justice. So next time, when you think of the meaning of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, think of it in these words. Like Jesus said, "As you would that men do to you, do also to them." With the institution of the new covenant, the timely nature of the Sermon on the Mount, expounding on that an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, was relevant because Jews would never again, not until the 1900s, become a sovereign nation. And so the new covenant was geared for everybody, including the Jews, to know how to fulfill the law of God and the will of God when they're not a sovereign nation. And that's why the law of Jesus is whosoever, anyone. There is no male nor female, slave nor free, Jew nor Greek. The law applies to anyone, everywhere, in any circumstance. Everyone can love their neighbor as themselves. And that's why, knowing that the temple itself would be destroyed and the Jewish rites and ceremonies would not be practiced even till this day, the new covenant was timed by God right at the time that it was needed. Jesus came right on time. The Bible says, when the fullness of time had come. And so for you and I, the remedy for an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is do unto others as you would have them do to you. Jesus says, don't fuss about if someone wants to take you to court for your jacket, just give them your coat also. If they want to put a severe load on you when you're a servant or an employee, he says, look, go the extra mile. That's the ultimate remedy to preserve yourself from injustice. When you follow the mandate of Jesus, you will be fulfilling the law of God. And that's why Jesus says, he that does these things and lives by this principle of love, this definition of love, will be fulfilling all the law and the prophets of the Old Testament, because that is ultimately the will of God and the new covenant. Now, in the absence of true justice, we don't have control over which nation we're born in, who's the president, what constitution governs the nation within which we live. Yet we are able to fulfill the will of God if we follow Jesus' direction, that we resist not evil. If someone slaps us on the right cheek, we should turn the other cheek. If someone wants to sue us at court for our jacket, let us give them our jumper also. If someone compels you to do a mile, go with him the extra mile. This is ultimately the way to fulfill the will of God, whether or not we're in an unjust constitution or a just one. God doesn't want us, his people, taking each other to court and possibly submitting someone to the cruelest of penalties over a jacket, over a disagreement over money, over words, over accusations, ultimately, we know that God is our judge. And so if we're willing to follow this mandate of Jesus, we will be able to save people rather than get them destroyed if they live in a dictatorship such as Zimbabwe or Germany back in Nazi times or any other dictatorship where they are not governed by true justice or the rule of law. That is true Christianity and true justice in the eyes of God.